You're not making any money. You're only slowing things down. Just 3% is enough to wipe you out.
My work is finished today, and your problems begin tomorrow. You've just ruined everything.
I didn't know a human career could be reduced to a percentage until that morning. I was called into the conference room without context, without HR, without the usual calendar theater that pretends decisions are collaborative. The room smelled like fresh coffee and confidence. Evan Calder sat at the head of the table, relaxed, already finished with me before I spoke a word. A budget sheet lay between us, printed, highlighted, final. Then he slid it forward, tapped a single line with his pen, and said it plainly, 3%, and you're gone. No build-up, no discussion, no acknowledgement of the years I spent making sure nothing ever went wrong. When I asked what this was really about, he didn't hesitate. You're not revenue, Evan said. You're overhead. I'm Dylan Ross, Director of Regulatory Oversight. The job exists so other people can sleep at night without knowing why. I worked where mistakes don't announce themselves, where one missed signature can turn growth into investigation. My name didn't appear on sales decks or earnings calls. It appeared on approvals that kept doors legally open. Quiet work, uncelebrated work, apparently optional work. Evan Calder was new, sharp, and proud of his lean leadership. He talked about speed like it was morality, cost-cutting like it was courage. He'd been in the chair long enough to want a win he could explain in a single sentence. Cutting me was simple, clean, performative. He pushed a checklist across the table and told me to start handing things over immediately. Access, files, documentation. The tone wasn't hostile, it was dismissive, like clearing storage space. No one in the room asked what I was legally responsible for. No one asked whose name was attached to which obligations. They just wanted the line item gone. That was the part that burned, not the firing, the reduction, being treated like an expense instead of a buffer between the company and consequences. Security escorted me out with practiced politeness. In the lobby, my phone vibrated. An automated email from legal waited at the top of my screen, status update pending due to role change. I stared at it longer than I should have, somewhere upstairs. They were celebrating efficiency, down here. Something important had just detached itself from the system. How are you feeling right now? Still calm? Or did that line hit a nerve if it did? Take a minute and message someone you trust. Just one honest sentence. Nothing polished, sometimes naming the feeling is enough to steady it. Where are you listening from today? If this story feels familiar, stay with me and consider subscribing. What happens next isn't loud, but it changes everything. The cost they never saw was the work that left no scars. I didn't spend my career chasing applause or credit. I spent it cleaning up small things before they grew teeth, minor discrepancies, quiet exceptions, the kind of issues that never reached reports because they never became incidents, when something disappeared before it could hurt the company. That was my signature. No email, no announcement, just another risk neutralized before anyone knew it existed. That was my job. Not power, not authority, responsibility. I was the person who stood between a profitable operation and the rules that allowed it to exist. One division in particular generated a massive portion of revenue, and every single transaction depended on my approval chain. My name sat at the end of it, not because I wanted control, but because someone had to be accountable when things went wrong. I didn't make decisions that boosted stock prices. I made decisions that kept doors open. Evan Calder never understood that. Compliance sounded abstract to him. Like an insurance policy you only notice when you cancel it, he trusted lawyers the way gamblers trust luck, confident it would show up when needed. To Evan, risk was theoretical, manageable, something smart people could clean up later. I had seen later. Later was always louder and more expensive. In the months before I was fired, I caught things no one thanked me for. A partner pushing limits that would have triggered scrutiny. A reporting shortcut that could have frozen operations. I fixed them quietly, because that's what you do when your job is prevention, when you do it right. People forget you exist. The bitterness didn't come from being ignored. It came from being erased. After I left, the company held an internal meeting to celebrate the cuts. Evan stood in front of a slide titled Operational Efficiency, smiling like he'd just conquered waste itself. He talked about discipline, focus, lean execution. He congratulated the room for removing unnecessary overhead. I wasn't there. But someone told me what happened next. As the applause faded, A mid-level manager leaned forward, voice low. Careful not to sound disruptive. He wasn't angry. He was confused. Who's signing off now? The question wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It was practical. No one answered. People looked at Evan. Evan looked at Legal. Legal looked down at their notes. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, the kind that tells you something important just broke and nobody knows how to name it yet. That was the moment they realized the savings were real, but so was the cost. When my contract ended, nothing dramatic happened. There was no confrontation, no final meeting, no urgent call asking me to explain myself. The paperwork processed quietly, the way bureaucracy prefers it. At noon, my access expired. By afternoon, my name no longer appeared where it used to sit at the end of approvals. It didn't feel like erasure. It felt like cold air moving through a room that had been sealed too long. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send warnings or write long emails outlining consequences. Silence was the most accurate response. My role had never been loud. It had always been procedural, conditional, precise. When the condition changed, the procedure followed. Within days, the system began to react on its own. Dashboards shifted colors. Certain workflows slid into a status labeled limited, a word that sounds harmless until you understand what it restricts. Requests queued instead of clearing. Reviews stretched. People noticed friction where there had been none, but no one could point to a single broken step. Leadership tried to outrun it. Evan Calder ordered operations to continue as normal. He called the slowdowns temporary and blamed caution for killing momentum. He pushed teams to keep shipping, to keep booking, to keep promising delivery dates that assumed permissions still existed. From a distance, it looked like confidence. Up close, it was denial wearing a suit. I watched without intervening, not because I wanted damage, but because intervention would have meant authority I no longer had. Responsibility doesn't linger after a contract ends. It transfers, or it stalls. In this case, it stalled. The most dangerous moments were the quiet ones. Meetings ended without conclusions. Legal reviews paused mid-sentence. Managers exchanged glances that asked questions they were afraid to voice. Everyone sensed a gap, but gaps are hard to accuse. Then the email arrived. It wasn't addressed to me. It didn't mention my name. It went to a distribution list with neutral language and a subject line that sounded routine. The message was short, clinical, and impossible to ignore. Certain operations require recertification. No explanation followed. None was needed. The room upstairs would read it the same way I did, with a tightening in the chest and a sudden understanding that momentum doesn't override rules. When a name disappears, processes don't collapse, they pause, and pauses, in the wrong places, cost more than noise ever could. I stayed silent as calendars filled and optimism thinned. Questions circled without landing. Decisions waited for signatures that no longer existed. Each delay hardened into policy. Each workaround demanded review. Nothing exploded. Everything slowed. That was the danger. Systems obey rules even when people pretend otherwise, and once obedience replaces speed, recovery becomes negotiation, not willpower. It taught me that absence can instruct faster than orders, and that silence, properly placed, can reorganize power without a single command from the shadows. Don't judge too quickly, because here comes the biggest twist. The first freeze didn't arrive with alarms. It arrived disguised as caution. One of the company's most profitable units was temporarily paused for review. That was the phrase used in the internal note. Carefully neutral, carefully vague. No one said shutdown. No one said risk, just review, as if time itself could solve whatever had gone missing. Within hours, calendar invites were canceled, shipments held, and approvals rerouted into silence. Then the calls started. Large clients didn't panic. They never do at first. They asked polite questions, the kind that sound casual but are not. Was this a delay or a change? Should they adjust expectations? Was there anything they needed to know? Each question carried the same subtext. Something feels off. And we noticed before you did. Upstairs, Evan Calder reacted exactly as I expected. He blamed legal for being slow. He accused compliance of overreacting. In a closed meeting, someone told me he waved his hand and said my name like a punchline, that exaggerating risk guy. He called me, as if caution were a personality flaw instead of a function. I heard all of this secondhand. Former colleagues reached out, Unsure whether they were asking for advice or absolution, messages landed in my inbox with careful wording, testing boundaries. I read every one of them. I answered none. Silence wasn't strategy. It was accuracy. I no longer had authority, and pretending otherwise would have been dishonest. The company didn't need my voice. It needed to understand what happens when safeguards are removed and momentum is asked to replace permission. By the end of the week, numbers began shifting, quietly. Dashboards updated without commentary. Forecasts tightened. Finance noticed before leadership did, because finance always notices first. Revenue dropped sharply in days, not quarters, but no one announced it. No memo, no town hall, just an unspoken agreement not to say the number out loud yet. That was the moment of real tension, not when operations paused, but when denial became policy. Here's the small lesson hiding inside that silence when organizations cut people who carry responsibility instead of visibility. The damage doesn't arrive as chaos. It arrives as delay, and delay. Once it touches revenue, spreads faster than any scandal. I watched from the outside as pressure built with nowhere to go. Evan pushed harder, teams strained, clients waited. The system, unmoved by optimism, continued to follow rules it no longer had permission to bypass. No one had said my name in a decision, but everyone was starting to feel the absence it represented. From here, the story begins to change direction. Risk doesn't disappear when you fire it. It goes home by the second week. Responsibility had officially returned to the company, not emotionally, not symbolically, but legally. The board ordered a full portfolio review, the kind reserved for moments when confidence gives way to obligation. Every product line, every agreement, every approval path was placed under a microscope, and the word that kept appearing was exposure. Evan Calder tried to outspend the problem. He hired external consultants by the hour, then by the team, then by reputation. PowerPoint replaced certainty. Advisors spoke in careful language and charged for every sentence. Still, one question kept stalling every solution who was qualified to sign. Not advise, not recommend. Sign. No one was ready. Interim names were floated, then withdrawn. Certifications required months. Temporary authority didn't exist for this category of risk. The company could analyze endlessly. But analysis doesn't carry liability. Someone had to own it, and ownership had just come back to the house. That was when my phone started ringing. Unknown numbers, polite voicemails, messages framed as check-ins, then as updates, then as invitations to talk. I listened to none of them. I didn't return a single call, not out of spite, but clarity. I wasn't employed, I wasn't obligated, and I wasn't willing to pretend responsibility could be borrowed from the outside. I watched the scramble with an unsettling calm. Meetings multiplied, costs ballooned. The board demanded answers that no consultant could legally provide. The harder leadership pushed, the clearer the gap became. Then, the numbers were assembled. Finance connected revenue streams to operational permissions, and the picture sharpened quickly. Nearly half the company's income flowed through the division that required a responsible signatory. Not a workaround, not a committee, a name, 47%. The realization didn't trigger panic, it triggered silence, the kind that follows bad math and irreversible decisions. Risk hadn't been removed, it had simply returned to its owner, bringing the bill with it, and for the first time since I'd left, no one was pretending it was manageable. That calm scared me more than anger ever could. I understood systems, and systems were speaking clearly now. Once responsibility returns, every shortcut becomes visible. Every risk demands a signature. Every delay converts into cost. I didn't feel victorious or relieved. I felt steady, anchored by the knowledge that consequences don't need intent to arrive. They only need absence, somewhere inside the company. Spreadsheets were updating again, slower this time, more cautiously. The machine was learning what it had lost, and I knew the next phase wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It would be procedural, expensive, and final. Because risk always settles where it belongs, regardless of who is still answering the phone. That understanding stayed with me, quiet and immovable. As the company stepped forward carrying weight it had tried to discard at last. The number no one wanted didn't arrive as a headline. It arrived as a footnote, buried inside an internal report, between softened language and optimistic projections. The truth finally appeared. Minus 47%, Not projected, not seasonal, actual. The kind of number that changes how people sit in their chairs. The kind that makes conversations shorter and voices quieter. Panic didn't explode, it spread, seeping through departments that had nothing to do with compliance but everything to do with revenue. Evan Calder reacted the way executives often do when math stops cooperating. He blamed the market first, then regulations, then timing. Finally, he circled back to me. In meetings I wasn't invited to. My name resurfaced as a cautionary tale, a convenient explanation. The narrative was simple. The company had moved too fast, and a former employee hadn't been flexible. It sounded better than admitting a structural failure from the outside. I watched that story harden. It was easier to accuse than to understand. Easier to frame the loss as stubbornness than to acknowledge that responsibility cannot be reassigned by frustration. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct the record. Silence remained the most honest position I had. When the calls came again, they were different, less polite, more urgent, offers floated without numbers attached, titles without definitions. The implication was clear if I returned, even briefly. The problem might shrink. I declined to re-sign. I didn't counter. I didn't negotiate. I simply said no. That refusal wasn't strategy. It was consistency. I had been removed because my role was deemed unnecessary. Accepting temporary responsibility would have validated the mistake without fixing it. Responsibility isn't a favor, it's a condition. The tension peaked in a closed-door session between leadership and legal. I wasn't there. But the outcome traveled quickly. Someone asked whether I could be compelled to help, at least to stabilize operations. The room waited for an answer that never came. The lawyer spoke carefully, not defensively, just accurately. He's not obligated. Those 3 words ended the debate, not because they were dramatic, but because they were final. Obligation is the currency of risk. Without it, authority dissolves into suggestion. That was when panic stopped being emotional and became operational. Projects paused, forecasts revised again, the blame cycle continued, but it had lost its target. I wasn't coming back, and the system had no replacement ready. Responsibility doesn't like vacancies. It exposes them. I felt no triumph, only a widening stillness, the kind that follows irreversible clarity. The number had spoken. 47% wasn't leverage, it was evidence. And evidence doesn't argue, it settles. I understood then that the collapse wouldn't be loud or theatrical. It would be procedural, defensible, and entirely self-inflicted, carried forward by people still insisting they'd made the right cut. You cut the wrong line when you assume responsibility is negotiable. The call came late, after weeks of silence that had done more damage than any argument. Evan Calder sounded composed, almost friendly, the way people do when they need something badly but don't want to admit it. He spoke about alignment, about moving forward, about putting the past behind us. He never said the word crisis, but it hung between us anyway. I let him talk. Then I stopped him. I'm no longer responsible. I didn't ask for money. I didn't ask for a title. I didn't threaten or explain. That sentence was enough, because it was true. Responsibility isn't something you pause and resume. It's a condition tied to authority. And mine had been cut deliberately. What Evan wanted wasn't my expertise. It was my signature. He tried another angle. Temporary engagement, advisory capacity, a short bridge until they found someone else. I declined each one without emotion, not because I wanted leverage, but because leverage wasn't the point. You can't borrow accountability the way you borrow time. There was nothing he could do. No contract to enforce, no clause to exploit, no obligation to trigger. The legal reality boxed him in tighter than any negotiation ever could when he realized that. His tone changed. Confidence gave way to restraint. The call ended politely, with nothing resolved and everything exposed. That was when justice stopped feeling abstract, without a person to blame or coerce. The company turned inward. The board began asking questions that hadn't mattered before. Who approved the termination? What analysis supported it? Whether risk had been evaluated or simply dismissed as expensive. The decision to fire me, once framed as efficiency, now looked reckless under scrutiny. An investigation followed, quiet at first, then formal. Emails requested, timelines reconstructed, assumptions examined. The board wasn't angry, it was methodical, which is worse. Method strips excuses down to facts, and facts don't care about intent. I wasn't involved, I wasn't interviewed, I didn't need to be. The record spoke clearly on its own, A cost-saving move had severed a critical responsibility without replacement. The consequences weren't unforeseeable. They were ignored. That's when I understood what real justice looks like in corporate systems. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. It moves slowly, then decisively. Once denial runs out of space, I didn't win anything that day. But something essential shifted. Power moved back to where responsibility belonged. The line they cut to save 3% turned out to be structural, and once it snapped, accountability traced its way up the chain, one decision at a time, toward the people who made it. Justice doesn't rush, but when it arrives, it rarely asks permission from anyone still in denial, anywhere. The board didn't wake up all at once. It woke up the way institutions always do, slowly, reluctantly, and only after the damage became impossible to reframe. At first, the questions sounded procedural. Who approved the cost reduction? What assumptions supported it? Which controls were reviewed before execution? The answers, when assembled, formed an uncomfortable picture. The 3% cut had been executed fast, clean, and proudly. What it hadn't included was a single documented risk assessment. That detail mattered more than anyone expected. As the review deepened, the narrative collapsed. There were no memos weighing consequences, no contingency plans, no replacement authority identified. What had been sold as discipline was exposed as impulse. The board didn't debate ideology, it focused on process, and the process had failed at its most basic obligation. Power shifted quietly. Evan Calder didn't argue. By then, he couldn't. His position eroded not because he made a mistake, but because he couldn't explain it. Decisions that affect core operations require evidence. He had enthusiasm instead. The board accepted his resignation without ceremony. The announcement framed it as a transition, but everyone understood what it was. The damage, however, didn't leave with him. Revenue gaps don't close because leadership changes. Contracts don't revive on optimism. The company still lacked a qualified signatory, and the review had made that absence official. What had been a temporary pause hardened into disclosure. That was when the company issued the adjustment. The forecast was revised downward, carefully worded, strategically vague, still unmistakable. Analysts noticed immediately. Partners recalculated internally. The number no one wanted became public knowledge, and silence gave way to controlled acknowledgement. Here's the small lesson hiding inside that moment. Boards don't punish failure. They punish undocumented confidence when risk is ignored rather than evaluated. Authority eventually reverses direction. I watched the announcement from a distance, feeling the shift settle. This wasn't revenge, it was correction. Systems correcting leadership, structure correcting impulse. The power I'd never held was finally being redistributed, not to me, but to process. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years preventing exactly this kind of exposure. When I was removed, exposure became inevitable. The board hadn't rediscovered wisdom. It had rediscovered procedure. And procedure, once enforced, doesn't negotiate. By the end of the week, new committees formed, reviews extended, momentum slowed permanently. The company would survive, but smaller, more cautious, and painfully aware of what efficiency costs when responsibility is mistaken for excess. That awareness marked the true turning point, not the firing, not the loss, but the moment authority returned to those willing to ask what had been ignored, and to accept that some lines exist not to be trimmed, but to hold everything else in place. Peace arrived in an unexpected form, an invitation that wasn't really an invitation. A former colleague reached out, careful with every word, asking if I would consider returning in an independent advisory capacity. No office, no title, just my name, temporarily, attached to the work they could no longer avoid. The proposed fee was generous, noticeably higher than what I'd earned before, as if numbers could rewind decisions. I declined the long-term offer without hesitation, not out of pride, and not to prove a point. I agreed only to assist with a structured transition documentation. Handover, clarity. Enough to stabilize what could be stabilized, nothing more. Responsibility, once severed, doesn't regenerate on demand. The tone of the conversations was different now. There was no bravado, no efficiency rhetoric, no talk of lean leadership. Everything was procedural, respectful, careful. They weren't asking for innovation or insight. They were asking for closure. That distinction mattered. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. The narrative forming around the collapse tried to find villains, but there weren't any. No sabotage, no hidden moves, no revenge. just decisions meeting their consequences without interference. The truth was simpler. No one destroyed the company. It dismantled itself by misunderstanding what held it together. Accounting, not anger, delivered the outcome. Risk, when ignored, doesn't explode at invoices. During the transition calls, I answered questions plainly and documented limits clearly. I refused anything that blurred responsibility or implied ongoing obligation. Each boundary restored order. Each clarification slowed the chaos. Systems prefer definition over hope. By the time my involvement ended, the shape of the company had changed. Smaller, slower, legally sound again, but permanently altered. The recovery plan focused on caution instead of growth, on permission instead of ambition. Then I heard about Evan Calder. There was no announcement, no farewell message, no explanation. His departure traveled quietly through informal channels, confirmed only by an updated org chart and the absence of his voice from meetings. Power rarely exits with ceremony when it leaves under review. That silence felt appropriate. I closed my laptop after the final handover and stepped away without regret. What remained wasn't bitterness or satisfaction, but legitimacy. Everything that happened followed rules everyone had agreed to, even if they had forgotten why. Walking away, I understood something fundamental about power and restraint. When systems are designed correctly, they don't need heroes or villains. They respond to inputs, remove noise, and settle accounts. People call that cold. I call it fair. Because fairness doesn't argue, doesn't gloat, and doesn't chase applause. It simply records what happened, assigns cost, and moves forward without apology. That clarity stayed with me long after the calls stopped and the noise faded. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. And accounting, unlike emotion, always balances. I think about the 3% more often than I should. It wasn't a dramatic number. It didn't sound reckless or cruel. It sounded responsible, clean, efficient, and that's why it worked. 3% was small enough to justify, small enough to ignore the human cost behind it. Then there was 47%. Revenue tied to systems, approvals, and responsibility that didn't look impressive until it disappeared. By the time leadership understood the connection, the math was already done. No emotion could renegotiate it. Looking back, I don't feel anger. I feel clarity. I see how easily organizations confuse expense with burden and how quickly they forget the people who carry risk quietly so others can move fast. I wasn't powerful. I wasn't visible. I was necessary. That distinction matters more than any title. This story doesn't end with revenge, because revenge was never required. No one needed to lose for me to win. The system corrected itself the moment responsibility returned to where it belonged. Law replaced confidence, process replaced ego. The outcome followed naturally. The lesson is simple, and it's not comforting. Some people aren't expensive. They're expensive to lose. When companies cut without understanding, they don't just remove cost, they remove balance. And balance, once gone, demands repayment. I walked away without triumph, but with something better, the certainty that fairness doesn't shout, doesn't celebrate, and doesn't rush. It waits, it measures, and when the numbers finally align, justice doesn't feel dramatic. It feels complete today. When I look back on everything that happened, the biggest lesson wasn't about power or revenge. It was about weight, the invisible kind people carry without ever being thanked for it. I learned that some roles don't shine, don't impress, and don't make noise, but they hold systems upright. And when those roles are removed, nothing explodes at first. Things just start leaning, slowly, quietly, until gravity finishes the job. Living through that taught me something deeply practical. If your work prevents disasters instead of creating applause, you may never be celebrated, but you matter more than you know. Emotionally, the hardest part wasn't being fired. It was realizing how easily years of responsibility can be reduced to a number on a page. That moment strips something from you, but it also gives something back. It forces you to separate your worth from how loudly others recognize it. There's a strange peace in that, a grounded kind of confidence that doesn't need validation to survive, on a human level. This story reminded me that fairness doesn't always look kind in the moment, but it is consistent. Systems, when left to follow their own rules, eventually tell the truth. You don't have to shout. You don't have to fight. Sometimes, standing still is the most honest response you can give. If you've stayed with me until this point, I'm curious, are you still here at the end? And after listening to a heavy story like this, do yourself a small favor, step outside later today, even briefly, and let your eyes rest on something that isn't a screen. That pause matters more than we admit. Where are you listening from right now, if any part of this story felt familiar? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who might need it, and if these stories speak to you, consider liking and subscribing. We're not just telling stories here, we're reminding each other that quiet work, done with integrity, still counts.